All right, glands. Some of this information for this video is going to be in your tissue chapter instead of the integumentary system. Some of it's going to be in your endocrine system chapter a little bit. But I wanted to bring it together here to talk about glands as a general thing, bring together both glands of the skin as well as glands that are located in other parts of the body. So glands in general, if you remember from learning a little bit about this with the tissues, glands are made of either cuboidal or columnar epithelium, stratified typically. So this is that rare situation where you have stratified cuboidal or stratified columnar epithelium. There are some cases of simple cuboidal as well. Basically, glands are a little more diverse. But cuboidal and columnar stratified layers are a little bit more rare because they are pretty much just present in glands. So here's one example, a sweat gland. This is stratified cuboidal, sweat gland that I showed you in the other video. Salivary glands are an example of stratified columnar epithelium. So to step back one moment, I want to tell you about types of glands. Glands can either be exocrine or endocrine. Exo means out, endo means in. So, and that relates to where these glands excrete or secrete to. This diagram is nice. It's showing that all glands have a common origination. So they're all formed by an inward growth of an epithelial sheet. So glands are made of epithelial tissue. And this is showing kind of the first step, this ingrowth or invagination of an epithelial sheet that then can go one of two directions. Either it has a duct that connects it to some sort of apical surface. So this could either be a sweat gland that connects to the skin surface, or it could be within the intestine. And this is the lumen of the intestine. Either way, this gland, the stuff it produces, goes out of the body. And so the intestine, remember that lumen of the intestine is technically considered outside of the body. So it's going to secrete something into some either lumen or out of the body directly. On the other hand, an endocrine gland actually loses this connection to the surface, and instead secretions are going to go into the bloodstream. This is the definition of a hormone. A hormone is secreted into the bloodstream. So endocrine glands, which we'll talk a lot more about in the spring, are going to secrete hormones into the bloodstream to have widespread effects throughout the body, opposed to outside. Here are a few of the endocrine organs in the body. Again, this is chapter, I believe, 16 in your book, but since we're talking about endocrine glands, I think it's a good time just to at least mention these. You've got, because the definition of endocrine gland is this tissue that secretes hormones, chemical messengers into the bloodstream. And I do want you to know about chemical messengers this semester. You'll have to for the autonomic nervous system, for example. So for example, the thyroid gland is located right here. It produces thyroid hormone, which then acts in the bloodstream. It's going to then target wherever there's receptors for that chemical. And you can see the endocrine system is very widespread throughout the body, down from the testes all the way up to parts of the brain. So, the learning check. What do endocrine glands secrete? Could you tell me the name of one and the general name as well? Okay, hormones. Some of these are steroids, they can be peptides, they can be amino acid derivatives. This part you might not know yet. That's okay. These are types of things that can be chemical messengers in the bloodstream. Going back to extracrine glands, there's a wide variety of types of extracrine glands. You don't need to know these classifications for this class. I want you to know that there is diversity in branching and structure. So there's simple and compound types. So when you look at sections of the skin, you might see different types of these things. And there's also different secretory structures in terms of where secretions occur from. So again, not going to go into these in detail, but I want you, as we see some of these throughout this semester and next, I want you to be able to recognize them as exocrine glands. These are the three that I talked about in the previous lecture. Not going to go over them again right now, but just to remember these three that we talked about. And I want to talk about the mechanisms they use to secrete. It's going to get a little confusing because one of these is poorly named. So I do want you to know about the modes of secretion. There's a lot going on in this picture here. The modes of secretion are three types. One is called merocrine secretion. So this is not referring to the name of the gland like before where it was sebaceous glands or oil glands. This is a way of secreting in that there is exocytosis from these vesicles. So a vesicle is releasing its contents into the lumen of the gland itself. This would then go out into the surface of the body or the internal space of the body. This here is a zoomed in picture of a single cell and what's happening. So if you take this cell right here, this is what it's going to look like in terms of what's happening inside the cell. This is your Golgi apparatus that's producing vesicles that are going to release the contents. For example, milk, sugar, and protein. Apocrine glands work a little differently. Instead of just being vesicles, it's similar, but they are actually pinched off whole chunks of cytoplasm. So it's not the Golgi apparatus packing up vesicles. Instead, there are just chunks of cytoplasm that kind of slough off. And then the contents are released the same way as over here, but in kind of almost larger vesicles by the time they get to here. They're technically not vesicles. They are chunks of cytoplasm. That's apocrine mode of secretion. Lastly, we've got holocrine glands. This I think of because it's like the whole thing. The whole cell disintegrates. This is common in stratified tissue because you have these layers here, and then the inner cell is going to just disintegrate, the cytoplasm breaks down, and that allows the inside to be released, the inside contents to be released. So now the confusing part, if you remember, there's a kind of cutaneous gland called the apocrine gland. That apocrine gland uses merocrine secretion. Isn't that awful? So let me actually go to this next picture here. Sweat glands use merocrine secretion, so that cytoplasmic, the vesicles that are released by exocytosis. Both apocrine and ecrine sweat glands use merocrine secretion. So these guys here are named very poorly. These ones that are within the armpit and pubic region. Sebaceous glands, those oil glands associated with the hair follicle, these use holocrine secretion. So that's that oily lubrication onto the hair shaft or the skin surface. This oil has antibacterial properties. It's kind of cool. So these are released from this stratified cuboidal tissue, and then those inner cells are going to disintegrate. And when they disintegrate, busts open, the inside contents of the cell is just going to pass through onto the skin surface. So let's do a learning check here. There are three types of glands, sweat glands here. Could you recognize them just by sight? And then for each one, the function, type of secretion, and method of secretion. So I think I have first here, yes. If you didn't get the names of them, these are your ecrine, those ones that are your typical sweat glands just onto the surface of the skin. Apocrine, stinky ones. Sebaceous glands, oily ones. What is the function of each of these sweat glands? What type of secretion? And by type of secretion, I mean what is the secretion itself? what is the secretion made of, versus method of secretion. That's going to be that mode in terms of Merocrine, holocrine, for example. So pause the video to do this. All right, so I'll let you go through this. Again, this is kind of the one that you got to remember. Apocrine sweat glands do not use apocrine mode of that release. Okay. Last thing here with glands, just wanted to throw this in here with glands because these are really important cells. You've seen these in the tissues, in the trachea, and in the intestine, these goblet cells. This is an example of a unicellular exocrine gland. That name should make sense, like thinking about unicellular exocrine gland. One cell that releases its product onto an external or out of the body. So this here is the intestine, your pseudostratified columnar epithelium, and these goblet cells or mucus cells that are embedded within the epithelial, the rest of the epithelial cells. Similar thing that you saw in the intestines. So these are cells that are going to be over here. Notice this is microvilli, so this is going to be an example of a cell that would be in the intestine. As you know that cilia are located in the trachea or respiratory passageways. Microvilli are located in the intestine. And this is showing the inside of the cell, these secretory vesicles containing mucin. So from this, you should be able to think about what type of secretion this is going to be. This is going to be your Merocrine secretion that's releasing vesicles via exocytosis, packaged vesicles from the Golgi apparatus. Okay, so what we've done today, this last video, is describe the typical anatomy of a gland and contrast the different types of glands, exocrine versus endocrine, and that this is related then to outside of the body versus bloodstream. Describe and compare different modes of glandular secretion. So those 3 different types, exocytosis being the type that occurs via with Merocrine. You wanted to put this here because you should know this term. Then describe the basic features of the exocrine glands of the skin. So these are the different types of exocrine glands in the skin. So notice for this, I don't have anything about those complex structures of the exocrine sweat glands. You don't need to know those, although you're welcome to learn them. All right, that's all.